listening to.
Hello, DrupalCon. Good to see everybody again. Thank you for joining us here on the main stage. We're going to get right into our next fireside chat here. So today's fireside chat is about how open source contribution can impact a business. I'm Tim Lehnen. I'm Hestinate on Drupal.org, the CTO of the Drupal Association. And our speaker today was named by Business Insider in 2019 as one of the top 10 people transforming tech and the only attorney among those people. She's a founding partner of OSS Capital and the author of Open Source for Business, now in its 3rd edition. She's an expert on intellectual property and open source licensing, and I'm thrilled to welcome Heather Meeker to join me here on the stage today. Hi, Heather. How are you doing?
I'm doing great, Tim. Thank you very much. I'm glad to be here.
Wonderful. I hope you're enjoying DrupalCon, and let's go right into the conversation. Great. So let's kick off with a question that's on many folks' minds when it comes to open source in the business world. So what fuels the common perception out there that participation in open source or use of open source technology can compromise the value of an organization's own intellectual property?
Well, I think on a certain level, that's a true statement. It's just maybe the wrong question to ask. It is true that by releasing open source software, businesses do make a decision to give away some of their intellectual property rights to the world. But, you know, having worked in Silicon Valley for maybe longer than I want to say, I would say that a lot of people overvalue intellectual property. And that might sound like a strange comment from an IP specialist, but here's what I mean. Intellectual property on its own is usually not valuable. I mean, assuming you're not, patent enforcement entity, and let's just lay that aside. So having intellectual property doesn't mean you have a business. It means you have maybe a tool to support a business. And many people actually place too much emphasis on the value of IP standing alone. So what a company is doing when it's participating in open source is it's making a business decision that it's more valuable to the business to share the IP than to try to monetize it. And that's a completely rational decision to make. And lots of companies make it very successfully. But I think there's still a sort of attitude that you build the business by holding on to all the IP you can. And it's understandable because there are people in the organization whose job it is to make sure that you're not giving away too much stuff for free and compromising the business. But there has to be a middle path. And one of the things that the open source revolution has caused people to do in business is to see that middle path instead of just seeing, well, I have to hold on to all the IP I can.
Sure. Okay, I think that makes a lot of sense. And I imagine there's people out in the audience who are brimming with questions, even just from that first response. So by the way, I do want to mention, if you have questions, do feel free to post them. We may not have time to get them all, but we'd be certainly interested in hearing from the audience. So go ahead and post those. Try and use the stage Q&A. And if we have the time, we will try and get to those. So continuing our conversation. So if a business recognizes that this middle path exists, as you've put it, for integrating sort of open source into their strategy, there's kind of 2 ways they could go about it. Within the Drupal project, we see businesses in our ecosystem that use Drupal, for example, as open source, as the central part of their business, whether they're end users who are using Drupal to build their own web experience, or if they're agencies who build sites on behalf of others, or service providers who do things around it. But how do you see those kinds of businesses integrating this open source strategy into their larger business strategy? And let's separate this into 2 components. First, just how they do it in terms of the business strategy itself and using open source. And then let's talk about contribution to open source.
Well, I would say that many businesses, not all of them, they go through a trajectory where first they start using open source software that third parties have created. And that's a pretty easy decision because it's free and it's mostly pretty easy to comply with the license terms, notwithstanding a lot of agita about that. And then as they get more into it, they usually get to the point where they are maybe contributing some bug fixes, maybe participating in some discussion groups about open source projects they're using and so forth. And then they might get to a further point where they're actually making significant contributions to the open source project. So I see companies mostly on this trajectory. They start at one place and then they get to the other. But it can be a little bit challenging to figure out the business basis for getting to that later path in the trajectory. And so to understand this, I think it's important to understand that all businesses use tools that don't particularly give them a business advantage. In other words, if you're standing up a website, say, you have to use a whole enormous stack of software to do that. And for the most part, what most businesses are doing when they're standing up a website is they're deploying some functionality, some app that's what generates their business, and that's what gives them a competitive advantage. But the infrastructure to get there is usually not something that particularly differentiates their business. It's just something they need to use. So they start out saying, okay, I can use these open source tools and they're free of charge and they're robust and all that stuff, and all that stuff is great. But then when they get to the point where they're making the decision to contribute back, that's where they have to make sort of the, I guess, mental adjustment to understand that contributing to the open source software actually also gets them a business benefit. And that business benefit ranges across a broad range. There are some, business benefits that I would describe as more sort of warm and fuzzy, like people like working on open source software. We're hiring engineers who like working on open source software. It's good for recruiting. It's good for them getting out into the community. It's good for our reputation. All that stuff is great, right? But there are also some more practical benefits to it too. And if you're, in an organization and you're trying to promote open source within the organization, this can be maybe helpful to people who are trying to do this, to focus on here are the practical benefits of it.
Sure. Yeah. Being
so
that internal open source advocate, I'm sorry, excuse me. I was just going to say, being that internal open source advocate is a really difficult position sometimes, depending on the organization you work in. You often have people who are not necessarily in the leadership of their organization, but who have a strong personal attachment and value to open source. So yeah, how do they communicate that up their organizational chain?
Yeah, so if you're in that position, it's great to say this will help with recruiting and advance our reputation. That's terrific stuff, but that might not be enough to convince your management that you should be expending company resources working on open source. So if you need something a little bit more nuts and bolts, what it might help to focus on is that the tools that companies use to deliver whatever products they're delivering, it can be important to be a stakeholder at the table of developing those tools, because you want to make sure that the tool is going to work for your business. So if you participate in the open source project, you can keep an eye on what the trajectory of the project is, that it's not going in a direction that you won't be able to use anymore, that it's being robustly supported and so forth. So that's, I think, one of the huge benefits, is just on a practical level, is making sure that the project continues to work with your business and that you have a voice at the table about how the project moves forward. I'll say one other thing, and that is that, and there's kind of a meme out there that if you release something open source, or then the world will become your maintenance and support organization. And while that can be true on a certain level, particularly for a project that has a very robust community, it's certainly cheaper for everybody to work together to maintain tools than for one person to do it alone, or one company to do it alone. But that's not the right reason to release an open source project, because it actually usually doesn't work unless you continue to expend a lot of resources to support it. So I don't think that's a very good justification or motivation, although it can be a side benefit. But a real important practical benefit is you get a seat at the table. And in open source, you get that seat at the table by participating. It's like power by participation.
Awesome. No, I think that rings really true with what we see in the Drupal community itself. So when I've talked to some folks who, whether in Drupal or in other adjacent but open source related businesses, one of their concerns is striking the right balance between client work and contribution work, right? They're looking at how their teams are spending their company time, and they say, gosh, maybe we should let our teams contribute on Friday. Maybe we should find a way to contribute to these projects. We think we see the value, but how do we kind of, what's the cost benefit against invested client hours? So can you provide some advice to agencies who are looking to put this in place? Are there policies that they should try and implement to avoid this perception of competition for resources and value?
Well, I think the most important thing is to have a clear policy. What that policy might be is maybe a little different for every business. And it is a business decision. It's a management decision. So you don't want either of two like outlier possibilities to happen. I think the one that some people are concerned about is that is what I would call a skunkworks project. So if you have somebody who's in the organization, they decide they're going to spend all their time on an open source project, and then particularly if they're going to later go off and try to make a business out of that project, that can be perceived very negatively and can cause a lot of problems. But on the other side of the spectrum, you can have people who are concerned that participating in an open source project in a way that will be beneficial to the business will be perceived negatively. You don't want that to happen either. So the best thing is clarity. And this is, I would say, something maybe a new practice, more or less, in the last 5 years or so, is that you actually have a specific written process for an employee, a developer coming to management and saying, I want to work on this project and I want you to approve that. And although that does formalize things, and maybe that adds a little bit of drag to the process, it's actually good when everybody understands where they stand, because then you avoid both those outlier situations where you have people working on projects without management being aware of it. And you avoid the situation where people are trying to, they're reacting conservatively and they're not participating because they're concerned that they'll be penalized for that in their job. So it's really good to get it out in the open, have a written process. It doesn't have to be, really heavy-handed. It's just, you should probably have a group, like someone from management, someone from technology, and maybe from legal too, to just look at every decision and saying, yeah, you can participate in this, go ahead, have at it. You can participate in this half time. We, want you to work on other projects, money-making projects for half time. Clarity is the most important part there. And I'll also say, by the way, that when you don't do that, you can actually run into some serious legal problems down the line, because when people participate in ways that the management perceives as they haven't been approved, then you actually have fights, legal fights, and that's not where anybody wants to be.
Right, because many folks in these organizations may have agreements about the ownership of the IP work they produce while under contract or while employed by these organizations. And
yeah, definitely.
That can get tricky when you've just committed that back to a public repository with thousands of other people. Sure.
I'll say one thing about that, by the way, if I can, is that these days it's getting more common when you do like custom work for a client to actually agree with the client that you will release the work open source. That's something you wouldn't have heard of 10 years ago. But it's becoming more common because the people you're working for, the customers, the clients, also are seeing the benefit of having the open source tools work with their business.
Sure. And actually, that reminds me, there are some industries and areas where it's not even just becoming common. In some cases, it's becoming required or even regulated. There's some work that we partnered with the European Commission, for example, and when they choose to undertake a large web accessibility project, for example, they are looking for only organizations willing to use public goods, open source software to implement these solutions. And that actually brings to another advantage to letting your teams contribute that I've personally seen, which is when a potential client is evaluating the vendors that they might want to work with, they're going to choose the one whose team they see on the project they're being implemented, right? If they see, hey, these 4 people actually built Drupal, then gosh, of course I'm going to pick them to do my Drupal project than this team who's not associated with the project at all. Even if they use it and are expert in it, if they haven't given back, they don't have that perception of being the experts who made it happen.
Yeah, definitely. It's almost like GitHub is the resume of the
Yeah.
21st century.
It's one of those things, and it's just interesting again along these lines because we've increasingly seen not just in government spaces, people ask in their RFPs, people asking in their letters of interest, people asking in their hiring process, what are the open source projects you've worked on? Can you demonstrate for us that you've done this? The Drupal Association has a contribution recognition system for the Drupal project, and we see people asking now, show us that you have this many contribution credits to Drupal core to prove that you really know your stuff. So it's really interesting to see that sort of transformation from skepticism about contribution to actually it's how we validate our talent. It's how we know that this is the group that we want to work with.
Yeah, and I think that gets back to the recruiting point, which is that, if the company participates in open source, then they're more likely to get the best and brightest people because those people have developed their reputation by participating in the projects.
Sure. I'm going to go into our sort of next little question here, and there's an audience question that's closely related to this topic that's kind of controversial. So I think these will go together nicely. So a lot of open source projects today are spin-offs from technology companies. So there might be a for-profit organization that exists and they've created a variety of open source projects. In Drupal, we're sort of the old school idealistic form of open source, where we're sort of an open source first organization, and there are companies that have adopted Drupal, so sort of the other way around. But can you talk about sort of the best practices and pitfalls briefly for sort of that successful open source model, whether it's an existing organization that's trying to make something open source, whether it's part of a project that exists or starting their own project, and how they should navigate the waters around making that central to their business?
Well, I'll talk about one modal case that we're seeing a lot of these days. And, my sort of participation in the open source movement mostly comes from the business end of it, right? And so this is what I'm seeing a lot of today. And that is that a technology organization, particularly all the big websites, all the big online services and so forth, they actually produce an enormous amount of open source software. And it's very common for people within those companies to start a project, and then they will leave to start a company around that specific project. We're seeing a lot of that these days. And I think that's for a couple of reasons. First, the companies, those big companies have already seen the benefit of producing open source software. So that was the first step. But then like the markets, the capital markets and the business market have also, recognized the value of companies that are started around these projects, particularly infrastructure-oriented projects. So you're seeing companies funded, at significant capitalization, that are being formed around open source projects that came out of bigger companies. So what you need to do in order to make that happen in a good way is you need to have communication, and you need to have a process, right? And when I mentioned that it's good to have a process, to have people working within the company, doing contributions and releasing open source code, this is one of the big reasons. You don't want those, engineers who are working on that project, often the people who started it and wrote most of it, you don't want them to leave the company on bad terms. You want them to leave the company on good terms. And often, if it works right and they leave the company on good terms, then the company gives them a head start with investment or assignments of trademark rights or what have you, so that they can stand up their business properly. And so that is something we're going to see more and more of. It's just like, it's very common now, and it's not stopping anytime soon. And the companies have to realize that this is a good thing for them. It's good to let the fledglings go, right? And also the people who are starting those projects within companies have to realize that they probably need to work with the company that originally supported them to create the project, so that it's an easy transition out. Often, the end game is you end up with a successful company getting spun up. And then also you end up with a business relationship between the original company and the company that got spun up. And that's probably the best case scenario there.
Awesome. So we've talked a lot about some of the benefits and the reasons behind why you would want to adopt an open source strategy and promote contribution. This question from Catherine in our audience asks about perhaps the less savory side of open source and business, which is sometimes a company might actually fork an open source project, creating their own version, also open source by the nature of licensing, but doing that rather than contributing back to the original community and the original project. There's reports, for example, that Amazon Web Services might be doing this with the Elasticsearch project. So this is obviously potentially very disruptive. How could we discourage this? Do you feel it needs to be discouraged? How do we handle this kind of perhaps exploitative relationship with open source that can sometimes appear?
Yeah, so there's been a lot of talk about the cloud services companies sort of extracting value from open source projects. And I don't need to say anything about that because it's been done to death, right? And I have also advised a lot of the companies who have struggled with this issue, adjusted their licensing models and so forth. But what I will say is that I hope that we are in a similar path to the one that the industry generally was on in the late 1990s. I'll explain what I mean by that. Like, if you go back to the late 1990s, when people were beginning to understand the value of the Linux operating system, people were really concerned about GPL licensing issues and violating GPL. And so a lot of private companies were reluctant to adopt the software because they were afraid of having to share their changes, right? And then over time, they got less fearful about it. And you fast forward to today, like all of the biggest companies are contributing to like the Linux kernel, right? Mm-hmm. So what happened in between those times is that the companies figured out that it was more important to share on infrastructure than it was to conserve their IP rights. Following from the question that you started our talk with, and then when you kind of transfer that to what's happening today with cloud services, there's a kind of a legal issue that the existing open source licenses don't require the cloud services providers to contribute back. That's a very broad way of saying it, and there's a lot of detail to it, but let's just say for the sake of argument that the open source licenses aren't working to compel the cloud providers to share changes. I hope, though, that the cloud providers will eventually get to the point where they see the business benefit of sharing changes instead of just trying to keep everything that they can. Because that's where the whole industry was 15, 20 years ago. And in order to get the industry from A to B on, say, Linux, it required this legal hammer, which was the general public license. There was a lot of changes about that and everything. And then eventually, today people are not terribly concerned about it, right? I hope that the cloud providers are on a similar path where they will figure out that even without a legal hammer, they should share. And the forking that you're seeing going on, particularly in this case, was because of this sort of licensing issue that has cropped up, that the licenses weren't sufficient to make the cloud providers share. I hope that eventually that won't be necessary anymore because the cloud providers will see the value of sharing independent of being legally compelled to do it. And, short of some kind of licensing incompatibility issue like that, it's actually not super common for projects to fork. They kind of have to fork when there's a license compatibility issue, though.
Okay, all right. Let's see here. We have another question about sort of the generalized support for open source projects. And in this case, it's from end user organizations. So Kevin asks, Johns Hopkins University recently started a free and open source software fund using a grant from the Sloan Foundation to contribute back to the projects they benefit from. Do you have thoughts on this approach to contribution? Know of other either educational institutions doing this, or of business cases in the corporate world, perhaps, that choose a funding model of contribution, maybe rather than a code contribution model?
Yeah, so for a lot of nonprofits and institutions of that kind, they may not have the resources to contribute directly. But I would say that at this point, for nonprofit funding of tech development, it's probably considered a best practice to require that anything developed with the funding be released as open source. And I've actually worked for various organizations setting up the terms of grants to do that. The nonprofit world is I think at this point well on the way to understanding the value of that. If they're going to give people money to develop software technology, then it has to be made available under open source licenses. And they may even have a preference about what kind of licensing model, like a GPL model or a permissive model that they want people to use. So I think it's great. And I think there will probably be more of that in the future. One thing that has to continue to happen is that there has to be more understanding generally that open source is kind of a gift to the world, because for a while it was kind of hard to get nonprofit status for an open source project. I think that has eased somewhat now, but that's a huge help in encouraging people to contribute to like open source foundations.
Awesome. Okay, very cool. Well, speaking of open source foundations, the Drupal Association is itself a 501c3 nonprofit supporting the Drupal community to build, promote, and secure Drupal. So how can we act as a nonprofit to educate, enable organizations to participate in Drupal as an open source project and sort of foster all of these opportunities that we've talked about today?
Well, so one thing that is very difficult to do, or, it's not impossible, but it's sort of a pain to do, is if a project requires financial support from, say, more than 2 organizations, like 2 is manageable, but once it gets to be more than 2, it really makes sense to have the development done via a separate entity like a community organization, mainly because that organization can then take in the monetary funds, as well as playing the community role, of course. But the contrast, which is you have a project that's developed in a private organization, if other people are going to contribute to that, it becomes very messy very fast. So it's actually better once there's a vibrant community for an open source project, to get the project out of the private entity and into a community organization that can collect dues, do fundraising, put on conferences, etc. Something that is, it's a lot more work and difficulty for one private organization to do. It's very important to have homes for open source projects in the nonprofit world.
Well, that's great. We've always thought of ourselves as the home of the Drupal community online, and it's great to hear it validated. I wish we had a lot more time to speak today. There's a number of really fascinating topics here that we could have dug into much more deeply. But I know there are those out there in our audience who would love to learn more about some of these things, whether they're business leaders who are thinking about increasing their open source participation, or just individuals interested in licensing, all sorts of things. So what are some resources of yours that people could use to learn more about these things, Heather?
Well, so I have a book called Open Source for Business. It's a book that is written to be accessible to technologists, business people, lawyers. So it goes into some of the details of the legality of open source, but not in a way that's too painful, I hope. And that's actually, it's available on Amazon, but you can also get a free copy just by going to my website. There's a place to sign up for a mailing list that is only used for news about book updates. and then you can download a copy of the book and some other documents that might be useful. So there's the book. I also, well, everybody reacts differently to the pandemic. One thing I did was a series of videos about open source licensing. And so I have a YouTube channel that has those videos on it. It's very easy to find. So I think there are about a dozen of them on different topics, so people are welcome to those. All that stuff is free of charge. And then other resources that I would recommend are Blue Oak Council, which is additional free resources for people interested in open source, not necessarily lawyers, and COS Media, which is information for people who are interested in creating businesses around open source.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much for your time, Heather. It's been a pleasure talking with you today. And I hope you've had a good DrupalCon experience so far.